She made $16.20 an hour. He was worth $1.8 billion. They had never met. On the morning of October 3rd, in a glass office on the 39th floor of a building on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, a man named Khalil Weston pressed a pen to a signature line and signed his name to the purchase agreement for a small post office in Birmingham, Alabama. He did not read the address. He signed 14 documents that morning. This was the fourth. 412 miles south, at 6:51 in that same morning, a woman named Sade Fontenot lifted a mail bag that weighed 34 pounds onto her shoulder and walked out the door of her apartment in Ensley, Birmingham. She had walked the same route for 14 years. She knew every cracked square of sidewalk. She knew which dogs barked and which ones only watched. She did not know the man who had just signed her building away. He did not know her name. But 9 years earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, she had spent $15 that quietly and permanently changed the entire direction of his life. He just didn't know it yet. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment and tell us where you are and what time it is there. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications. New stories go up every week. This one has a long way to go, and you do not want to miss where 175 cents takes us. The route started at the corner of Tuscaloosa Avenue and 16th Street at 7:04 in the morning, and it ended 4 hours and 22 minutes later at the intersection of Avenue F and 18th Street, 3 blocks from where it had begun. Sade Fontenot had walked this loop so many times that her body no longer needed to think about it. Her feet knew the angle of the curb at Parkview Drive. Her left shoulder knew to drop slightly when the bag shifted past the 20-pound mark. Her hands knew, without looking, which keys opened which cluster boxes, in the same order she had opened them for 14 years. She was 44 years old. She had worked for the United States Postal Service since she was 30, hired on a Tuesday in March, and assigned to Westfield Station before the ink on her orientation paperwork had dried. She had never requested a transfer. She had never been written up. In 14 years, she had called in sick on 9 days total, 7 of which were the week after her mother's first major fall. Her wage was $16.20 an hour. The mailbag weighed 34 pounds on a full day and 21 on a light one. Today was a full day. The Amazon boxes alone had added 6 pounds to her secondary satchel, and by 8:30, her left shoulder was already speaking to her in the low specific language of acute strain. She'd shifted the strap. She kept walking. This was not a complaint. This was just the math all morning. The same math she had been doing for 14 years, without writing it down because some math you just carry. Her mother's name was Celestine. She was 71 years old, and she had been living with Parkinson's disease for 4 years, though the first signs had come 2 years before the diagnosis. A tremor in the left hand, a slight drag in the right foot, the way she started setting her coffee cup down with both hands instead of one. Sade had noticed all of it and said nothing until Celestine could no longer pretend she hadn't noticed it herself. In-home care for a Parkinson's patient in Alabama averaged $54,000 a year. Sade had looked that number up on her phone one evening in a Walgreens parking lot and sat with it a long time before driving home. She did not make $54,000 a year. She made $33,696 before taxes. She broke it into smaller numbers. 3 mornings a week, a home health aide named Bernice came for 4 hours at $680 a month. The medication ran $214 a month after Medicare Part D coverage, which had a gap that kicked in every September and which Sade covered out of pocket through December. The rest of the care, the mornings, the evenings, the nights when the tremors were bad, Sade covered herself. She did not think of this as sacrifice. She thought of it as the next hour. What needed to happen in the next hour so the hour after that could happen too. Before leaving that morning, she had made a bowl of oatmeal, soft, with brown sugar, and no raisins because Celestine never raisins, left it on the kitchen table covered with a cloth to hold the warmth. She had set Celestine's medication in the small ceramic dish beside the bowl. She had checked that the television remote was on the arm of the chair where Celestine could reach it without standing. She had done all of this in 11 minutes, moving through the apartment in the quiet, specific way of someone who has learned to be thorough without being loud. Celestine was still asleep when Sade left. She always was. Sade locked the door. She lifted the mailbag. She walked. By 9:15, she was on the residential stretch along Parkview Drive, where the houses sat close together and the yards were small and mostly kept. She moved without stopping, reading addresses against her sorted bundles the way a musician reads sheet music, always 2 or 3 bars ahead. She passed the house at 314 Parkview Drive without slowing down. She always passed it without slowing down, but she always noticed it. The number on the mailbox, the house painted gray where it used to be yellow, a new fence, flower boxes in the windows that the previous owners had never had. Someone else's life layered over the shape of an old address. She kept walking. On the corner of Avenue D, she stopped at the house of Mrs. Alberta Sims, 78 years old, retired schoolteacher, 41 years on this block. That morning, along with the seed catalog and the church bulletin and a birthday card from a grandchild in Nashville, there was an envelope from the Alabama Medicaid office. Sade recognized the return address before she rang the bell. Mrs. Sims came to the door in her housecoat, glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at the envelope and her expression shifted in the small, specific way of a woman who has learned to brace for things. Sade said, "It's the Part D coverage notice. They changed the cost-sharing structure for neurological medications starting January." She paused. "If your doctor prescribes in the GAP category, you can apply for the extra help program through Social Security. I can bring you a paper form tomorrow if you need it." Mrs. Sims looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "How do you know all that?" Sade said, "My mother's on the same coverage." Mrs. Sims took the envelope. Then she said, "You want some water? It's getting hot already." Sade said, "I'm all right. Thank you, Mrs. Sims." She walked back to the sidewalk. She shifted the bag. She kept moving. That was how the mornings went. Not dramatically, not with any particular sense of mission. The route was the route. She walked it. She delivered what needed to be delivered. She noticed what needed to be noticed. She kept the knowledge she had gathered over 14 years, and she used it when it was useful and carried it quietly when it wasn't. She arrived back at Westfield Station at 11:26, 4 minutes ahead of schedule. She hung her bag on the hook in the carrier room. She signed a timesheet. She poured water from the cooler and stood a moment looking out at Tuscaloosa Avenue, at the way the station sat on the corner, the way it had always sat, wide and low and permanent looking in the way that things look permanent right up until they don't. The notice was still on the board. She did not need to read it again. 60 days had become 59. Tomorrow it would be 58. She had started writing the count at the top of each day's entry in her expense notebook, not because she needed the reminder, but because she had learned that the things you do not write down have a way of feeling less real than they are. And this was real. She took out the notebook. She wrote, "Day 2 of 61. Then she went to her locker, changed her shoes, and went home to make her mother lunch. The office on the 39th floor of the Weston Meridian building on Peachtree Street had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. A desk made of reclaimed walnut that had cost $14,000, and a view of Atlanta that on clear mornings stretched all the way to the ridgeline of Stone Mountain. Khalil Weston had worked in this office for 11 years. He had never once eaten lunch at his desk. He had never once stayed past 9 in the evening without a reason written in his calendar. He had never once in 11 years allowed the view to become something he stopped seeing. He was 52 years old, in a 2-bedroom house on 6th Avenue North in Ensley, the second of 3 children, and he had left at 22 with $340 in a canvas bag and the specific determination of a man who has decided that the place he comes from is not the place he is going to stay. He had not been wrong about that. He had also not been entirely right about what leaving would cost. Weston Meridian Development had 14 active projects across 5 states, managed $1.8 billion in assets, and employed 340 people. Khalil had built it from a single land acquisition in 2003, a foreclosed commercial lot in Decatur purchased for $180,000 with money he had spent 4 years saving from construction work and night school. He had done the demolition himself. He had poured the foundation himself. He had stood on that lot in the dark at 5:30 in the morning before the crew arrived and understood for the first time that the ground beneath him belonged to him. He had not forgotten that feeling. He had just gotten very far from it. Every morning he arrived at the office at 7:15. His assistant Odessa had his coffee ready, a double espresso pulled from the machine in the kitchen on 38, and she had laid his first 3 folders on the left side of his desk in order of urgency. He did not pour the coffee into the machine's branded cups. He poured it into a ceramic mug he kept on the credenza behind his chair, white, chipped at the rim, the glaze worn off the handle on one side where his thumb had rested for 30 years. There was nothing printed on it. There had been once, but whatever it said had long since disappeared. He had bought it at a Salvation Army store on 4th Avenue North in Birmingham when he was 22 years old, the week before he left. It cost him 35 cents. He had wrapped it in a flannel shirt and packed it in the canvas bag alongside his documents and his savings, and the 3 photographs he had decided to take. It was the only object from that life that had traveled with him to every apartment, every office, every city he had passed through on the way to where he was now. Odessa had once asked him why he kept it, a mug like that, in an office like this. He had told her it was the only thing in the room he was certain belonged to him. She had not asked again. The Westfield Station file was the 4th of 14 folders that morning. Odessa had placed a yellow tab on it, which meant it required a signature before noon. He opened it. The property at 2847 Tuscaloosa Avenue, Ensley, Birmingham. A USPS postal facility, 6,000 square feet, built in 1961, purchased by the federal government in 1974, recently decommissioned as part of the USPS Network Optimization Initiative. Acquisition price, $1.3 million. Projected development, mixed-use commercial, 3 stories. Estimated completion Q3 2026. Estimated return 340% over 7 years. He read the address again, Tuscaloosa Avenue, Ensley. He had grown up 4 blocks from that intersection. He had ridden his bicycle past whatever building had stood there before the post office. He had known those streets the way Sade Fontenot knew them now, not as destinations, but as the texture of ordinary days. He signed the folder. He set it in the outgoing stack. Then he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk. The drawer had 3 things in it: a copy of the company's original articles of incorporation from 2001, a photograph of his mother, Corrine, taken in 1911, standing in the front yard of the house on 6th Avenue North, one hand shading her eyes from the sun, and a small piece of paper folded twice, soft at the creases from being opened and closed many times. He took out the piece of paper. He unfolded it. The handwriting was his mother's, but older than he remembered it. Shakir. The letters formed with effort, as if each one had required a separate decision. He had seen her handwriting his whole childhood, on grocery lists and birthday cards and the permission slips she signed for school. This was not that handwriting. This was the handwriting of a woman whose hands had already begun to betray her. She had written 8 words. The girl from the post office read it to me. September 14. That was all. No name. No year. No other detail. He had found this note 3 years ago, tucked inside the envelope of his own letter, the letter he had written to her in the spring of 1996, the letter that had come back to him marked return to sender because the address he had sent it to was wrong. He had believed for 26 years that she had never received it. He had believed she had gone to her grave without knowing what he had written. And then he had sat in a chair into a room at Sunrise Care Home on Montclair Road, holding her hand in the last 2 hours of her life. And she had looked at him with an expression that contained no anger and no residue of the long silence between them, only something quieter and older, and she had said, "I got your letter, baby." He had not understood. He assumed she was confused, that the medication had tangled her memory. He let it go. He held her hand until she was gone, drove back to Atlanta, and did not allow himself to think about it for 6 months. Then he had gone back to Birmingham to sort her belongings, and he had found the note. 3 years. He had carried the question for 3 years. Who was the girl from the post office? What post office? How had the letter reached her when the envelope had come back to him marked undeliverable? He had no way to find the answer. He had no name. He had no address. He had only 8 words in his mother's shaking handwriting, and the knowledge that somewhere in Birmingham on a date in September he could not precisely locate. Someone had done something for his mother that he had not been able to do himself. He folded the note along its worn creases and put it back in the drawer. He closed the drawer. He picked up the next folder. This was 9 years ago. Tuesday, September 14, 2015. The last delivery of Sade Fontenot's afternoon route was a single envelope, standard white, hand-addressed, first-class stamp, placed slightly crooked in the upper right corner. The kind of stamp placement that meant a person had licked it and pressed it down in a hurry, or perhaps after a long time of not being sure they were going to send it at all. The return address read, K. West, Newford Street, NE, Atlanta, GA 309. The delivery address read, Khalil Weston, 314 Parkview Drive, Ensley, Birmingham, AL 3521T. Sade looked at the handwriting. Whoever had written the address had pressed hard with the pen, the way people press hard when they are writing something they have decided to commit to. She checked her handheld scanner. The address at 314 Parkview Drive had been flagged as undeliverable. Khalil Weston had filed a change of address 2 years earlier, in October 2013, and the forwarding period had expired. The system had no updated address on file. By procedure, the envelope should be stamped return to sender and placed in the outgoing tray. That was the rule. 14 years had made it automatic. She stood on the sidewalk in front of 314 Parkview Drive, which was now occupied by a family she did not know, and she held the envelope and did not move for a moment. The thing about working a route for long enough is that you start to read mail the way a doctor reads a face. Not the words, but the texture of the thing, the weight of it. She could not have explained what she knew. She just knew this envelope mattered in a way a utility bill did not, and that returning it felt like a different kind of action than the handbook implied. She took out her scanner and searched the forwarding database manually. Under Khalil Weston, Birmingham, AL, 1 entry, address updated October 2013, Sunrise Care Home, 442P1 Montclair Road. It was 3:47 in the afternoon. Her shift ended. Care Home was 12 miles away. She looked at the envelope. She put it in the inside pocket of her carrier vest against her chest. She finished the last 3 stops on the route. She returned her bag to Westfield Station at 4:03, signed out, changed her shoes. She walked to the bus stop on Tuscaloosa Avenue, counted 175 cents from the zippered pocket of her bag, and fed it into the fare box. The number 23 bus took 41 minutes to reach Montclair Road. Sunrise Care Home was a low brick building set back from the street, crepe myrtles trimmed into identical round shapes along the front walk. The lobby smelled of cleaning solution and something floral being used to cover it. The woman at the front desk wore reading glasses on a beaded chain. Her name tag read Doris. Sade said, "I have a letter for a resident, Corinne." Doris checked her computer. "Room 14B. You family?" "No, ma'am, I'm her mail carrier." Doris looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Sign in." Down the hall, turn left at the nurse's station. Room 14B was small and warm. A bird feeder hung from a shepherd's hook in the courtyard outside the window, currently empty. A television on a swivel arm played a nature program. The sound turned low enough to be ambient. The woman in the bed was smaller than Sade had expected, the way people who have been sick a while are always smaller. Khalil Weston had white hair cut close to her head and hands that rested on the blanket with the stillness of hands that had stopped fighting the tremor and simply let it do what it would do. She turned her head when Sade came in. Her eyes were dark and clear. Sade said, "Mrs. Weston, my name is Sade. I'm a letter carrier with the post office. I have a letter for you." Corinne looked at the envelope for a long time. Then she said, "I can't read it myself anymore, honey. My eyes aren't what they were." Sade stood in the doorway. She had thought, deliver the letter and leave. She had not thought past that. She said, "Would you like me to read it for you?" Corinne looked at her for a moment with the clear, dark eyes. Then she said, "Pull up that chair." Sade sat down. She opened the envelope carefully, the way you open something that belongs to someone else. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds, covered on both sides in the same dense, deliberate handwriting as the address. She unfolded it. She read it to herself first, quickly, just enough to understand what it was. It was a letter from a son to his mother, 26 years late, and it knew it. It did not make excuses. It said he was sorry for the years of silence. It said he thought about her more than he had shown. It said he had made something of himself, and he wished she could see it. But more than that, more than any of the things he had built, he wished he had called more. He said he did not know if she would want to hear from him after so long. He said he was sending the letter anyway because not sending it had started to cost more than he could pay. Sadie looked up at Khalil Weston. The old woman's hands were still on the blanket. The tremor moved through them like a current through water. She was watching Sade with the clear, dark eyes, and she was waiting. Sade read the letter aloud, slowly at first, the way you read something unfamiliar. Then, the words found their rhythm, and she read them the way they had been written, plainly without decoration. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the nature program and the distant sound of a cart moving down the hall. Corinne did not speak for a moment. Her hands were still on the blanket. Then she reached out and took Sade's hand. Her grip was stronger than Sade had expected. The tremor was there, the current moving through both their hands now, but the grip held. She said, "Thank you, baby." She did not say anything else. Sade sat with her for 7 more minutes. She did not know why 7. It was simply the amount of time that felt right before standing, felt right. She placed the letter on the bedside table where Corinne could reach it. She said goodbye. She walked back down the hall and out through the automatic doors into the September afternoon. The return bus came at 5:41. She sat home that evening. She opened her expense notebook. Under September 14-15, she wrote the day's entries. Groceries, 14.20. Bus fare to work, $175. She paused. Then she added one more line. Bus, Montclair Road, $75. She closed the notebook. She went to make dinner. The meeting was held on a Wednesday evening in the break room of Westfield Station, which was also the sorting room and the locker room and the only room in the building besides the carrier floor and the postmaster's office, which had been empty for 11 months since the postmaster had retired and not been replaced. Someone had set up folding chairs in 3 uneven rows. A whiteboard had been pulled from the wall and positioned at the front. On the whiteboard, in black marker, someone had written day 31 of 61. 22 people sat in the folding chairs. One person stood in the back with her arms crossed. Her name was Brenda Haynes, and she had been the floor supervisor at Westfield Station for 9 years, a position she had held with the specific authority of someone who was confused proximity to power with power itself. She had not written on the whiteboard. She had not set up the chairs. She had simply positioned herself at the back of the room in a way that communicated she was present. with it but all being what was happening. The man from Western Meridian was named Preston. He wore a suit dry cleaned that morning and shoes that had not been worn before today. He had a folder on the table and a bottle of water he had not opened. He spoke in the measured cadence of a man who had delivered this kind of news enough times to have removed most of the feeling from it. He talked about the acquisition timeline. He talked about the severance package, which was 60 days of base pay, plus a fee $200 relocation allowance for any carrier who needed to transfer to a different facility. He talked about USPS for career employees with more than 10 years of service. He used the word transition 11 times in 14 minutes. Then he asked if there were any questions. Reginald spoke first. He asked about the pension calculation for employees who were 4 years from their 30-year mark. Preston said he would need to follow up on that. Darlene, who had worked the morning window for 16 years, asked about the health insurance between the last day of employment and Medicare eligibility. Preston said he would need to follow up on that as well. After 3 more questions that required follow-up, a silence settled over the folding chairs that was not the silence of a room that had run out of things to say. Sade had been sitting in the second row. She had not planned to speak. She had come to listen, to understand what she was dealing with, to carry the information home the way she carried everything. She stood up. She did not look at Preston when she began. She looked at the whiteboard. She said, "I've been on this route for 14 years. I know the names of the people whose mail I carry. I know which ones are waiting for something and which ones are afraid of what's coming. I know who has a check that always arrives on the 3rd of the month and who has a prescription that gets delayed if there's weather." She paused. "You can't put that in a severance package. You can't relocate it." Preston was writing something in his folder. She kept going. "When I started here, my mother was healthy. She's not anymore. The people on my P route, some of them, they're the same. They got older while I was delivering their mail, and I got to know them. Not because it was required, because that's what 14 years on the same street does to a person." She stopped again, let it sit. Then she said, 9 years ago, I took a bus to a care facility to make sure a letter reached a woman who couldn't receive it at her home address, because some letters are not just paper. They're the last chance someone has to say something true." She sat back down. The room was quiet. Brenda Haynes, from the back, said nothing. Preston closed his folder. That night, in his rental car on the way back to his hotel on University Boulevard, Preston typed his meeting summary and sent it to Khalil Weston's office email. It was a brief document. He summarized the attendance, the questions, the severance concerns. Under notable comments, he wrote, "One senior carrier, 14 years, spoke about community continuity. Mentioned a personal bus trip in September to deliver an undeliverable letter to a care facility. Quote, some letters are not just paper. They're the last chance someone has to say something true." The email arrived in Khalil's inbox at 9:47 in the evening. He read it at 11:14. In his office, the city quiet below the windows and the desk lamp the only light in the room. He read the meeting summary quickly. He slowed at the final paragraph. He read it twice. A personal bus trip. September, a care facility. He read it a third time. He did not move for a moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He took out the folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, though he did not need to read it. He had read it enough times that the words were in him now, worn into him the way the glaze was worn off the handle of the old mug. He looked at it anyway. The girl from the post office read it to me. September 14. He set the paper on the desk beside the laptop. He looked at both things. The email on the screen, its light, sharp, and clean. The note in his mother's shaking handwriting, soft from being opened and closed for 3 years. One senior carrier, 14 years. A care facility, September. He stood up. He walked to the window. The city below was the city he had built his life in, and it was familiar to him in every way a city can be familiar to a man who has moved successfully for 30 years. He knew its streets. He knew its power. He knew which buildings were his and which ones he was going to acquire. He had stood at this window 1,000 times and seen all of that clearly. Tonight it looked different. He picked up his phone. He called Odessa. She answered on the second ring, which was what she always did regardless of the hour, a habit he had never asked her to have and had never told her he was grateful for. He said, "The Westfield Station acquisition, the carrier who spoke at tonight's meeting. Find me her full name and her schedule." Odessa said, "Is everything all right?" He said, "Book me on the first flight to Birmingham tomorrow morning." He ended the call. He stood at the window a while longer. Then he went back to the desk. He folded the note along its worn creases. He placed it in his jacket pocket against his chest. Not in the drawer. This time he was going to carry it with him. The first flight from Hartsfield-Jackson to Birmingham Shuttlesworth departed at 6:14 in the morning. Khalil was in his seat by 5:47. He had not slept. He had sat at his desk until 2, changed his clothes, and come back. No briefcase, no laptop. He had the folded note in his jacket pocket, and the name Odessa had sent him at 12:31 in the morning. Sade Fontenot, career carrier, Westfield Station, Birmingham. Schedule: Monday through Friday. Reporting 6:45, the flight was 41 minutes. He did not read. He looked out the window at the dark, giving way to gray over the tree line of Alabama, and he did not think about the acquisition or the development timeline or the $1.3 million he had already committed to the purchase. He thought about his mother's handwriting, the effort it had taken to form each letter. The Parkinson's had been in her hands by then, though he did not yet know it had been in Celestine Fontenot's hands too. He took a taxi from the airport. He gave the driver the address on Tuscaloosa Avenue. The taxi pulled up in front of Westfield Station at 7:09 in the morning. The building looked exactly like what it was, a postal facility built in 1961, low and wide, with a flagpole out front and a bulletin board visible through the glass door. The American flag was already up. Someone had been here before 7:13. He went in. The woman at the front counter was not Sadie. She was younger, and she looked at Khalil the way people look at someone who has arrived in the wrong place with too much certainty. He said he was looking for Sade Fontenot. The woman said the carriers were in the sorting room, and she could not let him back there. He said his name. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up a phone. He waited by the door, hands in his pockets, looking at the bulletin board through the glass. Westfield Station closure, day 38 of 61. Underneath it, a retirement party photograph from 6 years ago, a laminated safety record, and a child's drawing of a mail truck someone since had taped up and never taken down. Sade came through the door at the side of the counter. She had her carrier vest on and her sorting gloves tucked into the front pocket. She saw him and she stopped. She had known when Odessa called that morning to ask her schedule that something was coming. She had not known what. She looked at him now in the way she had learned to look at things that required her full attention. Not hostile, not afraid of looking. She said, "Mr. Weston, the building closes in 23 days. He said, "I know, that's why I'm here." He paused. "Mrs. Fontenot, September 14, 2015. Sunrise Care Home on Montclair Road. Was that you?" She looked at him. She did not answer immediately. The counter was between them. The fluorescent lights hummed above the sorting floor behind her. From somewhere deeper in the building came the sound of mail being processed, the mechanical rhythm of a place that was still doing its work, regardless of what was happening at the front door. She said, "A lot of carriers have worked this route over the years, Mr. Weston." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the folded piece of paper. He did not unfold it. He did not unfold it. He did not explain it. He simply set it down and took his hand away. She looked at it. She looked at the way it was folded, the worn creases, the softness of paper that has been handled many times. She did not touch it. He said, "My mother wrote that. I found it tucked inside my own letter when I went back to sort her things. 3 years ago. I've been carrying it since then because I didn't know who she was writing about or how to find out." He stopped. Then Preston sent me his meeting notes. Sade looked at the piece of paper on the counter. She reached out and unfolded it slowly with both hands. She read the 8 words. She already knew what they said. They were her words, in a way, or they were about her, which is not the same thing, but felt the same in that moment. She set it flat on the counter. Her hands shook when she held the letter, but her voice didn't. Khalil did not speak. He had stood in boardrooms for 30 years and held his face steady through all of it. He was not unsteady now in a way that showed. But something in the center of him that had been held in a particular position for 3 years shifted, the way a door shifts when the pressure on the other side is finally released. He said, "She died knowing I didn't hate her. I thought for a long time that was just who she was, that she had found her own peace with it." He looked at the note on the counter. It wasn't. Someone made a decision on a Tuesday afternoon and spent $1.75 and sat in a chair in room 14B for 7 minutes. That's what gave her that peace. Sade did not respond. She was not the kind of woman who filled silences that did not need to be filled. He said, "I'm not going to close the building." She looked at him. He said, "I'm restructuring the development plan. The post office stays on the ground floor, mixed use above and on either side. It will cost me more. I've already called the architects." He paused. "I also want to apply for historic preservation status with the city. There's a designation process through the Birmingham Historical Commission. It takes 6 to 8 months. I'll need documentation of the facility's role in the community." She said, "I can give you 14 years of that." He nodded once. Brenda Haynes appeared at the door to the sorting room. She had heard the name Weston Meridian from the counter clerk. She stood in the doorway looking at the two of them. and her expression arranged itself into the configuration of someone recalibrating information they had assumed was settled. Neither Sade nor Khalil looked at her. Khalil picked up the note from the counter. He folded it along its creases. He put it back in his jacket pocket. He said, "My architects will be in touch with the station this week. If the closure notice comes down today," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Weston," he said. "Khalil." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. She picked up her sorting gloves. She went back to work. He walked out through the glass door into the October morning. The flag moved in the light wind above the parking lot. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the building the way he had not let himself look at anything in a long time. Then he called a taxi. 14 months later, the closure notice was gone from the bulletin board. In its place was a construction rendering of what the block at 2847 Tuscaloosa Avenue would look like by 2027. 3 stories of mixed-use commercial rising above and beside the original 1961 structure, the flagpole still out front, the glass door still facing the street. The child's drawing of the mail truck was still there beside it, in the lower left corner, slightly curled at the edges now. The child's drawing had been there for 11 years. Nobody knew who had made it. Westfield Station was open. 19 of the 23 employees from the year before were still at their posts. 3 had taken early retirement with the enhanced severance package that Khalil's attorneys had renegotiated in November, a package that included an additional $400 in bridge funding for employees within 5 years of Medicare eligibility. 1 had transferred to the facility on Denison Avenue by choice. The sorting floor still smelled of ink and cardboard in the morning. The cluster box keys still had to be turned at a precise angle on the 3rd box from the left on Route 7. The number 23 bus still ran on Montclair Road. Sade still walked the route. Her left shoe still wore faster than her right. The mailbag still weighed 34 pounds on a full day. She still stopped at Mrs. Alberta Sims's house on the corner of Avenue D, and Mrs. Sims still came to the door in her housecoat, and they still stood on the porch for a few minutes talking about whatever the mail had brought that needed talking about. This had not changed, and she did not expect it to. What had changed was smaller than that and harder to name. 3 mornings a week, a home health aide named Bernice still came to sit with Celestine. The Medicaid gap still arrived every September and still needed to be covered. The expense notebook was still on the kitchen table, still opened every evening, still filled in column by column in the same handwriting. But the column for rent had a different number in it now, lower by $312 a month, because the community liaison stipend of $22 to $100 a month had allowed Sade to move her and her mother to an apartment on Ensley Avenue with 2 bedrooms instead of 1, with a window in the kitchen that faced east and let the morning light in before 7 Klein. Celestine liked the morning light. She would sit in the chair by the window with her coffee and watch the street below, and Sade would hear her from the hallway, not speaking, just present, and that sound, or the absence of sound, which was its own kind of sound, had become part of the morning the way the mail bag and the route and the New Balance shoes were part of the morning. In Atlanta, on the 39th floor, the old mug was still on the credenza behind Khalil's desk. The chipped rim, the worn handle. Odessa had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing things that have always been in a room. Khalil had not. He noticed it every morning when he poured his coffee, and what it represented had shifted in the way the meaning of objects shifts when something has happened to change the context in which you hold them. He had not heard from Sade Fontenot since October. He had not expected to. They had said what needed to be said, and the thing between them was not a friendship or a debt or an ongoing arrangement. It was a completed circuit, a current that had run from a Tuesday afternoon in September 9 years ago, through a chair in room 14B, through 8 words in a dying woman's shaking hand, through a meeting summary, through a piece of paper placed on a counter. The current had run and completed, and what was left was the kind of thing that does not need to keep moving to be real. The bottom drawer of his desk was still there. He had not opened it in 11 months. On a Thursday evening in December, 14 months after the meeting at Westfield Station, Sade came home from the route at 4:18. She changed her shoes at the door. She checked on Celestine, who was asleep in the chair by the window, her coffee gone cold on the side table, her hands still in her lap. Sade took the coffee cup to the kitchen. She put a blanket over her mother's legs. She started dinner. At 6:30, Celestine woke up. She called for Sade. Sade came in from the kitchen and sat on the arm of the sofa across from her mother's chair. Celestine said, "How was your day, baby?" Sade said, "Good, Mama, just the route." Celestine looked at her for a moment the way she sometimes looked at her, not with the unfocused gaze of a woman whose illness had begun to blur the edges of things, but with the clear, specific look of a woman who has been paying attention to her daughter for 44 years and knows when the answer and the truth are not exactly the same thing. She said, something happened today. Sade was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Celestine nodded. It was just she did not press. She had learned long ago that her daughter carried things quietly, and that the carrying was not a sign that something was wrong, but a sign that something was being held with care. After dinner, Sade washed the dishes. She dried them, put them in the cabinet. She wiped down the counter. She turned off the kitchen light. She opened at the table with the expense notebook. She zoomed into that evening's page. She wrote the entries in their column. Bus, 20T5. Groceries, $22.40. Bernice, Tuesday won $70. Her hand slowed. She turned back through many months, the pages growing thicker under her thumb, until she found the page she was looking for. September 14, 2015. The receipt was still there, pressed between the pages, its edges soft and slightly yellow from 9 years of being pressed between paper. Bus, Montclair Road, on 75. She looked at it for a long time. She did not take it out or move it to a shelf or do anything that would make it into something other than what it was. It was a bus receipt. It was 175 on a Tuesday in September, the only entry in 14 years of notebooks that she had never once considered crossing out. She closed the notebook. She placed her hand flat on the cover for a moment. Then she got up, turned off the lamp, and went to check that the door was locked. In the chair by the window, Celestine's breathing was slow and even. The street below was quiet. The morning light would come through the east window before 7 clam. The route would begin at 7:04. Some things were still the same. Some things were lighter than they used to be. She went to bed. This story is fiction. Sade Fontenot does not exist, and neither does Westfield Station or Khalil Weston or the note in his mother's handwriting. But the circumstances that shape this story are not invented. As of 2024, there are approximately 158,000 letter carriers employed by the United States Postal Service. The average carrier walks 7 to 8 miles a day. The median wage is $56,120. Many have worked the same route for more than a decade, long enough to know the names, the patterns, the letters that matter. In Alabama, the average annual cost of in-home care for a Parkinson's patient exceeds $52,000. The Medicare Part D coverage gap affects an estimated 3.2 million beneficiaries each year. These numbers sit behind a great many kitchen tables, where someone is doing the same math Sadie does in this story, breaking the impossible into smaller and smaller pieces, and hoping the pieces add up to enough. I wrote this story because the people who show up on the same streets every day, who know which mailbox sticks and which neighbor is waiting for something, are doing something that cannot be quantified in an acquisition document. Some letters are not just paper, and some of the people who carry them are holding more than mail. If you are currently caring for a family member with Parkinson's disease and need information about benefit programs and financial assistance, the Parkinson's Foundation helpline is available at 1-800-473-4636. Before we go, we want to ask you something. Think about a letter, or a call, or a conversation, or something as small as a bus ride that someone took for you, something that cost them almost nothing but landed in your life, like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Maybe they knew what it meant. Maybe they had no idea. Maybe you were the one who did that for someone else and never found out what happened next. That is the thread this story is made of. The ordinary things that people do when no one is asking them to. The decisions that are technically optional. The extra step that no handbook requires. Those decisions do not disappear. They move. They travel forward through years and hands and rooms, and they arrive somewhere, and someone's life is different because of them, even if the person who made the decision never finds out. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if this story reminded you of someone who made a quiet decision that mattered more than they knew, tell us about them. You do not have to use their name. Just tell us what they did. We read every comment, every single one. If this story reached you, please hit the like button. It takes 1 second and it means everything to a channel like this one. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. These stories are about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the most ordinary moments. That is where all the real things happen. Not in boardrooms, not in acquisition documents. In break rooms and sorting floors and care home hallways and bus seats at 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon. Stay kind, stay blessed, and never underestimate the power of one quiet act of love.